Hello and welcome. My name is Mallory DeMay, and I'm going to be the host for this TLC session. Thank you for joining us for our current session, which is You Don't Outgrow Autism, Supporting a New Type of Learner. And so I'd like to welcome our presenter, Jessica Guire.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start off with a little introduction, and then I'll introduce myself as well. Although once a rare neurological disorder, autism has become prevalent in our childhood population. You might have noticed the increased rise in the rates of this population since actually discovered in 1948. That's when autism was actually put on the books as a diagnosis. We have a growing community of adult learners with what we call ASD, which is Autism Spectrum Disorder. You'll hear me refer to them as ASD. It's just easier than saying Autism Spectrum Disorder every time. But this group of adult learners is actually entering the college classroom. And so we need to give attention to this particular group. And as educators, we can create a classroom which is supported and helps these learners with the difficulties they have despite the autism diagnosis. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've been in education for 20 years. I started in higher education upon graduating with my master's. And I've worked in all different areas of education, including course development, face-to-face courses, teaching high school at the high school level at a private school. And so that experience actually helps me with research and things that I'm really interested in. And I'm highly interested in this particular topic because, one, I'm the founder of an autism awareness nonprofit group, but I'm also a mother of 3 kids, and my youngest is on the spectrum. And so he was diagnosed over 9 years ago now. He is now 11. And so I have a lot of experience with dealing with some of the autism related challenges that he has. Everyone who knows me knows that I really like the shock and awe of news stories. And so it's very fitting that I start with a shock and awe. This comes out of MIT, and this particular quote is somewhat of what this particular scientist feels is a foreshadowing of what we're going to see in years to come. She stated that in 2025, half the children born in the United States will be diagnosed with autism. Now, just to give you a little perspective, in 2018, 3.8 million babies were born in the United States, just a flat number. However, in 2018, 1 out of 59 children were born and diagnosed with autism. Now, this is a stark difference than what we saw in 2002, when only 1 in 152 children were diagnosed with autism. So we see that over the years, there has been an increase in the diagnosis. And in the autism community, both researchers and just advocates for this particular disability, there's a lot of arguing about what the cause is. And this presentation is not about that. But no matter what the cause is, we definitely have an epidemic. When we go in a decade, a little over a decade, from 1 in 59 children to 1 in 152, we see that there is definitely an epidemic when it comes to the diagnosis of children with autism. So the first thing we've got to discuss is, what is autism? Some of you might be aware of what autism is. Maybe you have that diagnosis. Maybe you are a parent or a family member of someone on the autism spectrum, or maybe you've had the opportunity to work with individuals that have autism. Nonetheless, autism is a spectrum disorder. And what that basically means is there's a wide variety of challenges that range from mild to severe. And a very successful autistic professor of special education, Dr. Shore, once said, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. On my title screen, I actually had a puzzle piece. You might have noticed it. And that has become the icon for autism. The original piece was decades ago when a parent of a child with autism drew a puzzle piece with a child crying. And their particular take on this was because it was so puzzling to deal with someone with autism spectrum disorder. And later it was changed to just the puzzle piece, and a very popular nonprofit, Autism Speaks, actually uses that puzzle piece. So you might have seen it. Sometimes it's depicted in the color blue, which they have chosen, and sometimes it's a rainbow piece, indicating that there's a variety to this particular disorder. Many years ago, there was a movie, Rain Man, and that particular character was labeled autistic. However, the character, which was played by Dustin Hoffman, was more of a savant. So a lot in the autism community were not impressed with the way that Rain Man was depicting that particular disorder. We now see in today that there's a show, The Good Doctor. It's on ABC. And it shows a more successful person with autism being able to communicate and being able to hold a job, unlike what we saw in Rain Man. So some of the challenges that come with autism spectrum disorder include social cues, communication. Sometimes there's repetitive behavior and sensory issues. Despite all of this, there's been many in history who have been successful despite that autism diagnosis. And although some of the people I'm about to name came before the actual diagnosis was a diagnosis, they showed characteristics of what today would be labeled as autism. For instance, Hans Christian Andersen, the famous children's author; Tim Burton, the movie director; Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland; actors such as Dan Aykroyd. And then I can't leave out, this is probably one of my favorite people, is Temple Grandin. And she is an author and she's autistic. However, what she's really credited with is the invention of refining the livestock restraint system. Now, I live in Texas. I don't know much about cattle, but what I do understand is when they put them through the chutes, it's a very stressful, it can cause injuries. It's a very rough transition for the cattle. And she created a therapeutic, stress relieving, injury-free device. So with all of these people that I've named, what we can see is, despite an autism diagnosis, individuals on the spectrum are able to achieve greatness, and just like their neurotypical peers. Many times, individuals with autism are extremely intelligent and bright, but because of these hidden challenges, sometimes it's compromised, and we don't see the greatness that they're providing. So as educators, it's wonderful to be able to create an environment in your classroom in which these individuals can succeed. When it comes to college, those with an autism diagnosis often struggle with motor skills, learning style, sensory issues, social skills, communication challenges. And you notice that all of those things that I listed, if you think back to your own college experience, you used those skills often. So if as educators, we're often taught to look at the student as a whole. These become part of this student, and being able to address these challenges helps them to be successful in the classroom, and that's our ultimate goal. So let's look at some numbers. This applies to us because 50,000 Americans with autism will enter into adulthood each year, and 1/3 will enter into the college classroom. So if we look over a decade, we're looking at 500,000 teenagers moving into adulthood, into the college classroom, but they're aging out of the autism services. Majority of the services are provided for K through 12, and they have advocates and counselors and therapists and even their parents who can help them. However, we knock them into the college classroom, and the services and the advocacy is not as strong. So as educators, we can begin to fill that void. So I want to look at some of the problems that these individuals with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, are seeing when they transition from K through 12 into our college classroom. I'm going to look at 4 problems, including the challenges of the transition, also the low enrollment, the expensive programs, and then overall just the lack of support. The one that is most pressing in terms of initial need is the transition. Everybody knows that going to college out of high school turns into a major shift in how your life is. So how our life changes from being a teen and parents, teachers hovering over you into a college classroom. The transition between high school and college proves very difficult for the autism individual. College retention rates are very low for those who enter that have the diagnosis versus their counterparts. Most of them don't complete the coursework. Some students on the autism spectrum experience sensory overload, a distress when it comes to social and communication issues, and just the overall demands of the classroom. Online education actually begins to bridge that gap because there's so many ways that online education actually helps somebody who has the autism spectrum disorder. Out of the Center for Student Accessibility at CSI, the associate director had stated that the biggest problem is that the student must learn to self-advocate. And that's difficult because remember, they're moving out of K through 12. And during that time, they had the teachers, the counselors, the therapist. And I know with my own son, they were able to pick up on there were challenges and there was a need there. However, in the college classroom, oftentimes us as professors, we just don't handhold like that. We expect these adults to be able to function in a neurotypical world. There's an abrupt shift with this support, and finding the help can be difficult, and especially if that particular person with the diagnosis isn't able to self-advocate. They're going to struggle with organization, planning skills, and more so than their neurotypical peer. One of the biggest things that there seems to be problems with is the executive functions. And executive functions are a neurological based skill set that we generally have. However, when it comes to the autism diagnosis, it begins to impact that executive function. And this impacts paying attention, starting a task and finishing it, seeing it through completion, organizing and prioritizing. That remains very, very difficult for the individual. Also, understanding that there's different points of view, regulating their emotions, and self-monitoring. And we find that in college, we need all of those. Those executive functions are what make us successful. And when we're not able to balance those skills, it becomes an issue. So common learning barriers of someone with ASD includes sequential learning. They become easily bored with repetition. They might not understand why something is important, which if you're an educator, you know that's generally the question anyways by all students. But in this particular case, the student begins to seem apathetic, as though they don't care, because it's not meaningful, it's not relevant to their life. They often have difficulty academically, and if they're not good self-advocates, they're not reaching out for help, and therefore it becomes difficult to rectify the situation academically by the time intervention shows up. So those are the challenges of the transition. And then we see low enrollment. 15% of post-secondary enrollment in a four-year university comes from that autism population, so 15%. So not a very big part of the group. And because of that, a lot of times there's not a lot of awareness. And then it leads into the programs. When you have a low population, you have less of a need, so there's less programs. The other problem with programs at many of the schools is the expense. There's about a dozen US colleges that have a very solid autism program. However, highly expensive. And with the cost of tuition anyways, these programs often fizzle out, not only because of money, but because we go back to the low enrollment. So we kind of are seeing a trickle effect here. Besides the low enrollment and the expensive programs, we look at lack of support. And this goes back to the actual person identifying that they need help and reaching out for accommodations. So I feel as an educator and also as a parent, because obviously I don't want my kid to slip through the cracks when he makes it to college, is I want to give instructors, educators, professors some best practices. So some ideas on what you can do to make your classroom more autism friendly, for lack of a better term. So here are my key ideas. Is I'm looking at focusing on the learning style, communication, also social skills, sensory differences, motor skills, and coping skills. So just a few of the strategies that you can implement in your own classroom. When it comes to learning styles, we know that we have a variety of learning styles in the classroom. And so being able to focus on these different learning styles when we're trying to teach. Someone with autism might miss verbal cues. They might miss deadlines. Remember, they have the lack of strong executive functions, so therefore they can't plan things out. I know here at Ashford we have calendars and checklists, and I like to repost those. I like to send them out because a lot of times it's overlooked. On the first day of class, there's a lot of information to get through, and for the students to be able to see the policies in their hand in front of them. This also allows for the student to print them out. So being able to provide review sheets, checklists, and even doing a little check-in. I use one of the functions in the gradebook where I can click and I can send a reminder to everybody who has not turned in the assignment at that point. And I like to do that the morning of the actual due date, and it sends them a reminder to their email letting them know. Not only does it help neurotypical students, but it also helps the students with ASD. Another strategy is the communication, and I've already touched on that a little with the email, but sometimes providing some lecture notes, some additional notes, expanding on the teacher guidance and instructor guidance, that can be helpful. Also, when we're in the classroom, calling on a student and expecting them to generate an answer immediately can be difficult for a student with autism, if not anybody in that case. So giving a little bit more time for an exchange of ideas is often really helpful. Now, I touched on social skills a little bit, but when it comes to the online class, I see that a lot of the students get left behind in group work. So as an instructor, checking in and looking for proper inclusion of these students is often helpful. And actually, I should have mentioned this earlier, but we've got to remember that oftentimes we won't know that the student has autism. Even if they have some accommodations, we don't necessarily know what that disability is. So these best practices and these strategies can actually help just the general population of the students. So with the social skills, we can also focus on making sure that our rules are written very specific and very concrete, because the autism learner actually prefers something that is extremely straightforward and upfront. So the clear and concise method of communication is probably our best practice there. Sensory differences, the sensory differences of someone with autism actually can be its own presentation. However, for this particular presentation, I think one of the things that would help a student with this disorder would creating announcements that don't have all the graphics and the embedded videos. And I'm considering doing two. One that has all the graphics and the videos, and then one that's just the text, because when it comes to sensory differences, those graphics and those videos could actually be very distracting to the autism learner. And the last, not the last one, the motor skills. In online education, the motor skills isn't as important. We're not running, jumping, having to sit in a desk for an hour. But one of the things I found is sometimes the font choice that the student uses impacts their visual spatial organization of the paper. For the classes that I teach, we use APA formatting, and that calls for Times New Roman. However, there's other fonts that have a bigger space deviation between each of the letters that helps a student with autism be able to use this visual spatial skill a little bit easier. So if you see my example on this particular screen, you can see how the two different fonts look very different and might help with that motor skill. The last one is coping skills, and I don't have a lot for that one simply because we're basically not creating the environment that the student is working in. They're able to dim their lights or create quietness or rock or chew or whatever they need to do to be able to deal with that coping skills of the stressful situation. Finally, and I've given a few presentations on various types of learners, and I always come back to this point, and it is servant leadership. And I'm a big advocate of teachers being servants. So being able to serve first and lead second. And this gives the students empowerment, confidence, and it shows that we're actually invested in them, and in turn they invest in the education as well. So with this, remembering that you are serving the student, and what you do in the classroom is what you're doing to help them be successful. So in the end, one size does not fit all, but I feel like the tips that I've provided today not only help the individual with autism, but also could help the general population or anyone else dealing with any type of disability. It could be really helpful for them to be successful. So I want to open it up now to any questions. I'm going to leave this screen up, so in case anybody needs to email me. And I believe Mallory said she would put my email in the chat as well. If you want to continue this conversation, I would love to do so. But I'm open for questions as of now. Mallory, I'm not sure if I'll hear the questions or.
No, I did ask them to go ahead and write them in the chat if they do. So I'm not seeing anything come in, but I do have the email address up so they can always message you privately. We did have one question come in from Jay Moore. He's asked, are students with autism identified for the instructor somehow?
No, because under privacy, you wouldn't know what their disability is. You would simply know if they have accommodations through disability services. I have never had a student tell me that they had autism. Now, I have had students tell me they were dyslexic or they had ADHD, but they were forthcoming with it by emailing me. So yes, you wouldn't necessarily know unless they choose to disclose that information.
And then Becky asked, do you know of any colleges that have accommodations for autistic students, like on a larger scale?
Yeah, there are several. And I actually had pulled up a list. Some of the bigger universities, there's actually top 10. And they were some of the larger universities that have the ground college. I don't have that list with me. If you want to email me, I can get you the list. But they did have very detailed types of services that were specifically geared towards the autism community, which I thought was just amazing. I'm from Texas, and actually Texas A&M, one of our bigger colleges here, they actually just created one for individuals with Down syndrome, and they can go through a whole program, and it's all geared towards them. And to see that is just, oh, so hopeful, because I think if they could take that on a different scale with students with autism, I mean, we would see the rise in students in our classroom and students being successful. So, but anyways, if you want to email me, I can get you that list because I know I saved it on my computer.
Sure. And then this will probably be the last question since we're running out of time. Virgil had mentioned that he has an older brother who is high functioning in his 40s. And he has a harder time with online courses. Do the instructors in this case do more video chats than other students?
You know, and see, and that goes back to the whole thing I was saying about if you met one person with autism, you know, you've met one person with autism. Because I know my son personally, he does so well online. Like when he plays video games online, his interaction is amazing. And I think maybe because it's the video image and they use a lot of avatars and he's able to communicate that way. But I know in some of my classes, I do use some video of myself, and I would like to get to a point where I could do more of my guidance and my lecture that way and create it as a transcript too, so they can download it, which would be awesome because they can listen, they can read, and then they can take it with them. I know a lot of the videos they have with some of the assignments, there's not a transcript. And so it's like, oh, I got to re-listen to all of this. So I think online is definitely evolving to more of a professor interaction with the video. And I think that's a good thing.
Awesome. Well, I will go ahead and close it out there, but I want to thank you everyone for attending this session, and thank you, Jessica, for your presentation, and everyone enjoy the rest of TLC.
Thank you.